I'm Shihoko Goto, Vice President of Programs and Director of the Asia Program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. For those of you who are logging in to an FPRI event for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. The Institute was established in 1955 in Philadelphia, and our mission then, as it is now, is to provide nonpartisan analysis on key foreign policy challenges through the lens of history, geography, and culture. And I'm excited today that we will be spending the next hour addressing issues concerning cross-strait relations and the status quo that has underpinned it, not just from the vantage point of the United States and its relations with the PRC, but rather through the lens of Taiwan and its own interests. Here to lead the conversation is Joshua Friedman, who is a non-resident fellow of FPRI's Asia program and an affiliated research scholar at the University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Study of Contemporary China. So with that, let me now turn it over to you, Josh, to get us going.
Great. Thank you so much, Shihoko. And thank you to FPRI for convening us here. I am really extremely excited to get to be part of this conversation with three of I think I have good judgment here, three of the best young scholars and observers of Taiwan. If I can say young, hopefully I can say young. Certainly the level of insightfulness of their observations is true. I am glad that I've known all three of these panelists for quite some time and have had the opportunity to have a number of really great conversations about Taiwanese politics and about many other topics over the years. So I'm very excited to have them here to discuss the status quo. Just a few housekeeping notes. As Shihoko mentioned, we'll run until 9 a.m. here, which I believe is 10 p.m. for our Taiwanese counterparts, and some other time for everybody else wherever you're logging in. I'll open with a few remarks. I'll let each of our panelists have a couple of minutes to say their piece and launch the conversation, and then we'll have an open-ended conversation for the rest of our time. And we'll also make sure to leave plenty of time for question and answer from the audience. There is a Q&A box in your Zoom panel screen somewhere. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the Q&A box. I will be monitoring that, and I will make sure to do my best to incorporate your questions in the latter part of our session today. So just to get us going here, obviously, if you're here, you're interested in some way in Taiwan. It's very easy to see these days how important Taiwan is geopolitically and how important Taiwan-US PRC relations are. It's very easy to have a superficial conversation about Taiwan. It's a little harder to get deep, and that's why it's really exciting that we have all three of the people here today. And when we're talking about Taiwan, the sort of concept that comes up perhaps most frequently is the idea of the status quo. And the status quo literally just means the way things are, the current state of affairs. But that's complicated when things are always changing. And with Taiwan in particular, it's about a very contested and complicated diplomatic arrangement that has defined Taiwan's status for many decades now. So if we flash back a little bit, say to 2003, a lot of things were different then. George Bush was president. Everybody was watching Wicked. Okay, so not everything has changed, but George Bush was in charge, and he was trying to, work with his PRC counterparts. And when Premier Wen Jiabao came to Washington and they met, he said, very explicitly, the U.S. government policy is one China based on three communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. And the United States opposes any unilateral decision by either China or Taiwan to change the status quo. And of course, the three communiques are agreements between the United States and the People's Republic of China in 1972, 1979, and 1982, and the Taiwan Relations Act passed by Congress in 1979. And the wording of each of these is different, but they collectively acknowledge something similar, that the U.S. accepts that China has the view that there's only one China, which includes Taiwan, but itself does not necessarily agree to that position. And it recognizes the PRC as the sole legal government of China for bodies like the United Nations, but it does not itself take a position on Taiwan's sovereignty officially. And of course, it maintains the ability to sell arms. That was a bit contested, but it has continued to do so to this day. And at that time, in 2003, George Bush was speaking of the status quo after the PRC side was very frustrated with then leader Chen Shui-bian, who had proposed a potential referendum on uh, the PRC's weapons aimed at Taiwan. And George Bush added that the United States was not pleased by the leader of Taiwan, that he might be willing to make any unilateral decisions, of course, to change the status quo. And so, in one sense, 20 years on, the status quo has been extremely successful. It is still peaceful, despite how unpeaceful it is in the region, how much there's been a military buildup, among other things. We can say that with so many conflicts in the world, the Taiwan Strait has actually been relatively successful. And in the eyes of Taiwanese citizens, as well as people elsewhere, the status quo is quite popular. People in Taiwan, at least, a plurality of citizens certainly support the status quo over any other action. But in the other sense, the status quo doesn't quite make sense anymore. To paraphrase the late Steve Goldstein, who was a keen observer of Taiwan, if the status quo looks so different now than what it was in 2003, what is the meaning of this term that we keep saying to keep things the way they are? Obviously, in the intervening 20 plus years since 2003, the situation in the Taiwan Strait has changed a lot. The People's Republic of China has changed a lot. It has gotten richer and much more powerful militarily. The United States has changed a lot. Speaking here from the United States, I can assure you that it has changed. And Taiwan itself has changed a lot. And we're now, back then it was their second president. Now they've successfully transitioned to their fifth. And again, from the Democratic Progressive Party. Um, so we have a lot of questions here. What does the status quo actually mean today? And this concept, which still underpins the relationship between Washington, Taipei, and Beijing, is it still useful? So I will introduce each of our three panelists in turn. The first panelist I'll turn to is Lev Nachman, who is a professor of political science at National Taiwan University. Lev, take it away.
Good morning, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much, Josh, for organizing the panel and having me here. I'm going to start with just a few points, and then my other panelists can build on them, and then we'll get into more discussion. The thing that is first and most important about the status quo is that nobody likes the status quo. It is undesirable. In an ideal world, no one would accept the current situation, but we don't live in an ideal world. We unfortunately live in one that there is currently no outcome that is agreeable between China, Taiwan, and the United States. And so instead, we use this moniker status quo to essentially mean the uncomfortable situation, the uncomfortable compromise in which no one is really happy. However, by having this sort of mutual unhappiness, it has kept peace, as Josh very nicely pointed out, for decades. So in its most basic definition, the status quo, even though there's lots of different interpretations of it, has meant that Taiwan maintains de facto but not de jure sovereignty, meaning that it still is able to pass its own laws, have its own citizenship, but is not formally recognized and is excluded from international organizations and the international community. And in return, it exists as a free and fair democracy in which the PRC does not have actual sovereignty over Taiwan, but at least blocks Taiwan's ability to have formal recognition. Even though there's lots of sort of different interpretations of how far we can take status quo to mean, it has essentially meant this sort of uncomfortable compromise in which Taiwan currently exists. Now, if there is one other most fundamental thing that's worth highlighting, and Josh mentioned this, but it's really important to sort of put a point on it, 80+% of people in Taiwan want the status quo. This is from the longest running public opinion survey at National Zhengzhi University here in Taiwan, but any public opinion researcher, I do public opinion research myself, we find this over and over again. People in Taiwan want the status quo. And specifically, what these surveys kind of show is that when people say status quo, that's them actively not choosing unification with the PRC and the formal declaration of independence as the country of Taiwan. So these two sort of extreme options we know people do not want. Instead, what they want is this sort of very vague, undefined uncomfortableness in which Taiwan currently exists. So having that number in mind, knowing that it's exactly what Taiwanese people want, I think needs to sort of be at the forefront of any discussion about what policies are being taken. Knowing that, beyond sort of the great power competition, people in Taiwan want to just be able to continue to exist in this an ideal but form of existence that allows them to be a free and fair democracy. So even though it's not ideal, any sort of actual change to this status quo is, in my number one concern, potentially increasing the likelihood of conflict. The status quo has kept conflict out, and the concern is that any sort of change to this equation, regardless of which side it comes from, does more to increase the likelihood of conflict more than to sort of decrease the likelihood of conflict. However, it's also, and the final thing I want to say is that to maintain the status quo is truly a three-pronged equation. It's not just Taiwan, and it's not just the PRC, and it's not just the United States. It takes all three sides of this equation in order to maintain the status quo. Not all of these sides are equal in power. Even though we talk about Taiwan and the PRC as if they are like equal one-to-one, they are not one-to-one. The PRC is gigantic in terms of its power and influence, and Taiwan is small compared to its power and influence. I think it's reasonable to say in most circumstances that the PRC is the one that has done the most changes to the status quo in the last, say, 5 to 6 years, ever since the Nancy Pelosi visit. And I highlight the PRC's role because of the quantity and the quality of the military drills that have changed after Nancy Pelosi's visit, where there is now a drastic increase in both the number of drills and also the nature of those drills. That to me has sort of done the most to increase the possibility of conflict, even though people will highlight things that William Lai says as being irresponsible and sort of trying to challenge the status quo, which I think under certain examples might be true. William Lai's microphone is much smaller than the PRC's military. So when we talk about what can be done to sort of maintain the status quo and who's responsible for changing it, I think we need to sort of keep size and proportion of these three different sides in mind. And I didn't get to the United States, but I'll save that for later. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lev. That was a great overview and putting out a bunch of provocative questions on the table. For other listeners, William Lai is the current president of Taiwan of the Democratic Progressive Party, which tends to take a harder line toward Beijing. And some of his statements, of course, have rankled his counterparts across the strait. So now we'll turn to Wei-Ting Yan, who is an assistant research fellow at the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica, I would say biggest and most important, or one of the biggest, most important research institutes in Taipei, and where I spent a year when I was doing my PhD. So, Wei-Ting.
All right. So first of all, thanks, Josh, for inviting me as well. It has been a pleasure to think about what the status quo mean and then trying to form more coherent remarks. And so for my beginning remarks, I'm going to focus on 3 points. And I think those 3 points echoes what Lev just kind of talked about and also responding to some of the prompts Josh sent us last week. So echoing what Josh said in the beginning, that the status quo has indeed helped maintaining peace and stability across the strait. But the first point I want to make is indeed that the reason why maintaining the status quo has helped Taiwan stabilize with peace and stability has been relying on one key condition, which is that for the past almost 20 years, all sides' definition of what maintaining the status quo meant overlap to a significant degree. And so without going into details, but essentially for China, even though the status quo means one China principle, but for the past 20 years, it has a 1992 consensus at kind of supplementing that. And with the 1992 consensus, it allowed the KMT to interpret in the one China, but opt for different interpretation. That creates some room for interpretation. And the same with Taiwan as well. And when that, and for the United States, as Josh mentioned, is the one China policy. So when that overlap was large enough, there was enough basically room to maneuver, to compromise, to de-escalate within that status quo framework, because internally, all sides, they can claim that they're preserving the status quo while emphasizing on that common shared ground. But then when they go back internally, they also can maintain enough political stability, flexibility to interpret what that concept means in their own way and trying to manage their domestic expectations. And so, put differently, I think why the status quo has helped maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait was not because everyone truly agreed with what that status quo is, but because the gap between respective definition was smaller. So that's my first point. And my second point is, Lev kind of touched upon this already, and I want to kind of hammer it more by saying that the status quo itself indeed it's not ideal, and it's also not a fixed point, and it moves. And I want to say that the biggest shift has been happening on the Beijing side. And that has been causing the overlap between all sides, been shrinking and even close to disappearing. Because as time, so basically as time goes by, the acceptable status quo for different parties, especially Beijing, has changed. And that shift has also, I think, pushed both Taipei and Washington to adapt their own interpretation in response. So I think right now for Beijing and Washington, the most workable version of the status quo basically is what Lev talked about, which is that Taiwan is not a de jure, does not have a de jure independence, but it does have de facto governance as Republic of China and Taiwan, and the cross-strait differences are managed without coercion. But for Beijing, this is no longer sufficient. And I think the key turning point I have to say was Xi Jinping's 2019 January 2nd speech. And so probably many of you in the audience would know. So in that speech, he explicitly tied the 1992 consensus, which was used to kind of help with that different interpretation part. He basically tied 1992 consensus directly to one China, two system. And so since then, anything basically since 2019, Beijing essentially is only emphasizing on the one China principle as the guidance for maintaining the status quo. So anything that is not under that framework is a red line. And so I think the problem is that this is essentially why status quo has becoming not a stabilizing concept, but becoming a rhetorical label. And it increased the risk of misinterpretation and tension escalation. And so with that, my third point is, so I thought about it, and I was thinking whether we should continue using the status quo. Is that a useful concept at all for cross-strait relation? And I am going to make the case that I think we should still use the status quo, despite it is more risky now. And the reason why, especially I think for Taiwan, there's still a strong incentive to keep using the language of the status quo, because as Lev said, Beijing already treats Taiwan's current status quo unacceptable. So abandoning that basically is giving Beijing an excuse for more coercive action. And second, Lev also already talked about currently the majority of Taiwanese people will tell you they prefer the status quo. So I think there's still some domestic kind of benefit for the leaders to maintain that status quo. Okay, I'm going to end my comments here, and I can continue in the later rounds of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei Ting, and thank you for that both all three of those excellent points, really helpful. I know we've set up David a little bit here because previously I've had conversations about where all of our speakers think about the usefulness of the status quo. But David Sachs is a fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. David, take it away.
Great. Thanks for having me, Josh. So I'll start my remarks by just saying that I agree with Lev and Wei Ting that, of course, the status quo has served us incredibly well. And by us, I mean not just the United States and Taiwan, but I would even argue the PRC has been served incredibly well by the status quo. For the PRC, I think, decades of not pressing its claim to Taiwan allowed it to, quote, hide and bide and to present itself as a non-threatening rising power to attract a tremendous amount of U.S. trade and investment, and even a lot of investment from Taiwan that really helped fuel its economic takeoff. For Taiwan, that room enabled it to democratize, to become a semiconductor powerhouse and a top 10 trading partner of the United States. And as you noted in your opening remarks, Josh, I think that the Taiwan Strait is remarkable actually for the absence of conflict, certainly since 1958 and the Second Taiwan Strait crisis. But what I would argue and put forward this morning is that the status quo is no longer a really durable or useful concept for us to think about. And so what has changed, I think picking up on what Wei Ting said in her remarks, is that China has fundamentally changed. I don't think that we can sit here in December of 2025 and argue that Beijing actually implicitly, even, but obviously explicitly, does not buy into the status quo. I think that looking back on what allowed the status quo to really last for decades was it was underpinned by U.S. military power, by Taiwanese military power, to be honest, vis-a-vis Beijing, and the notion that Beijing had many other priorities that it wanted to pursue above Taiwan. But since Xi Jinping has come to power, I don't think that we could argue anymore that that's the case with China. And so what I would say today is that if we ask ourselves to define the status quo in December 2025, to what extent is it how we would define the status quo in 2022, 2019, or even 2012? And I would say, to pick up on what Lev said, it's far, far different. So if we were sitting here in 2021, we would define the status quo as the PRC respecting the median line in the Taiwan Strait, not violating Taiwan's air defense identification zone, not having major military exercises, not just in the Taiwan Strait, but actually around Taiwan, refraining from having the PLA Navy and Chinese Coast Guard on Taiwan's east coast. We would also define the status quo in political terms as China not pushing its interpretation of UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, not pushing the so-called One China principle on countries throughout the world. And in exchange, the United States would not publicly push its definition of Taiwan's unresolved legal status or its view on Taiwan's unresolved legal status. And we would also say that it would be the absence of targeted economic sanctions against Taiwan. So now if we look at in December 2025, all of those things have fundamentally changed. Everything that I just listed no longer is the case in terms of how we define the status quo. So if we're sitting in Washington and we're urging both sides to, quote, respect the status quo, I think this is falling on deaf ears, and I think it frankly makes the United States look feckless because we are not willing to enforce this status quo as Beijing continues to erode it. So the bottom line for me is that I think the notion of the status quo connotes stability where there is none. I think it also breeds some sense of complacency that cross-strait relations are manageable, that they're under control. And I think it's counterproductive because it gives false assurances and confidence about the trajectory of cross-strait relations. I think from a U.S. policy perspective, the status quo also puts the United States on the back foot. It is fundamentally a reactive policy. It allows China to probe, to test the limits of what the United States and Taiwan will tolerate. And we are in the position where we are just responding to Chinese moves. So I would put forward a slightly different interpretation. And again, this isn't to say that the United States should throw out its one China policy. I believe that the one China policy continues to serve U.S. interests well. But I think that we should talk about our affirmative objectives in the Taiwan Strait. Our objective is to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, to enable Taiwan to continue to thrive, to protect U.S. interests, not only in the Taiwan Strait, but in the Indo-Pacific. And what that means in terms of our cross-strait policy is that we need Beijing to understand that as it presses and as it continues to erode the status quo, we are going to have to do certain things differently to preserve our interests. And so this is a policy that enables much more, interaction between all of the sides, and it signals to Beijing again that as it continues to ramp up military pressure on Taiwan, the United States is going to have to look at its security cooperation approach to Taiwan. That as Beijing continues to squeeze Taiwan's political space all over the world, the United States is going to have to also make adjustments to its policy. And so I think what we've seen, and this might come out in more the Q&A, and I'll end here by raising it, is that there's a view in Washington that our one China policy also has to be much more flexible to adapt to changes in Beijing and Taipei, but principally to changes in Beijing. And so I think that the status quo is a far too obviously static of a concept, and we need to, have something that is much more flexible going forward. And I'll end here.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And I think all three of our speakers and panelists have put forward plenty to get us started. Let me just quickly push back, David, while I let Lev and Wei Ting formulate some responses, which is one point that both Lev and Wei Ting brought up, is that the status quo is extremely popular in Taiwan and among Taiwanese citizens who are pragmatic about their relationship with the PRC. How would you respond to the sort of pushback that this system is still quite popular among the people who are most directly affected by it?
Yeah, I think that my view is consistent with that. I think that my view is actually the way that Taiwan is best able to protect the status quo as it perceives it, which is that Taiwan, as Lev said at the beginning, is a de facto independent country that can pass its own laws, that has a military, although it is squeezed although it is squeezed internationally by the PRC. But I think that basically sitting on our hands and saying that the PRC respects the status quo and is adhering to our notion of the status quo is, I think, misguided and actually endangers the status quo that Lev and Wei Ting cite the Taiwanese people and are in favor of. So if I think what I'm talking about is I think more about how we operationalize our understanding of how we preserve the status quo. I think that if we talk in terms of a macro picture, at a high level in terms of how Taiwan is viewed internationally and Taiwan and how it positions itself domestically, then I'm in favor of that status quo. But I just don't think that our current policy toolkit will enable us to really protect that for decades into the future.
Great. Thanks, David. Lev, I see you nodding. Do you want to respond, especially since you were very direct that the status quo, despite its flaws, might have some parts definitely worth preserving?
Oh, yeah. So let me first of all, and this might surprise you, Josh, come out in radical agreement with David, because I fully endorse what he said about how China has absolutely been taking steps to change the status quo. And I will particularly pick on the United States for having not done enough to help do its part to maintain the status quo. Where I think I would, say things like advocating for Taiwan's participation unofficial as an unofficial observer in international organizations, that would have done plenty to help maintain the status quo that we could have done. Encouraging like-minded democracies to stand by Taiwan as its de facto independence, saying that we want any sort of conversation with the PRC to include making sure that they understand that Taiwan is something that we're not just going to sit idly by on, making sure that the PRC is not using UN resolutions irresponsibly, or that the PRC's role in the UN is not being used to sort of squeeze Taiwan using international law and international organizations. There's plenty that could have been done, that should have been done, that I would agree we are behind in helping maintain the status quo. where I would perhaps disagree is to say that therefore we should take harder stances or do something to escalate our own status towards Taiwan. Which, if I'm to, and I don't want to put words in David's mouth, so feel free to correct me later on. But where I would disagree with those who say that we should abandon the status quo is where people say, well, therefore, if the PRC is going to take stronger action, we should take stronger action. Stronger action being things like formally recognizing Taiwan, things like using a lot of symbolic victories to sort of show the PRC that we are going to stand with Taiwan, things like calling the Taipei Economic and Culture Office the Taiwan Economic and Culture Office. Things like that, I don't endorse because I don't think they actually increase the relative stability and peace in the Taiwan Strait. And I think they do plenty to sort of add to more uncertainty from sort of this three-dimensional equation. So, I agree that, especially from the United States, is the United States way in which we have tried to maintain the status quo. We are behind in trying to help. And unfortunately, in ways that I think both other panelists have touched on, because the PRC has escalated, it's sort of given the signs to many in both the United States and Taiwan that we should also escalate with sort of our changes. And that's where I would really express caution, especially to people, say, in Taiwan, who believe that the response to the PRC's challenging of the status quo is we should also be challenging the status quo. I don't know that that increases the relative peace and security in the Taiwan Strait. And as I will always go back to, it's not what Taiwanese voters want. I'll stop there and let others chime in.
Well, just allowed to push back on that very, I think, very good answer. If the U.S. is not going to escalate, that which is sort of a natural response to others' escalation, what can anybody in Washington or elsewhere do to express their dissatisfaction with the PRC's moves without further escalating the situation?
Yeah, so let me reframe what I mean by escalation. So I don't think increasing military arms sales to Taiwan and making sure that Taiwan is spending more on defense spending is changing the status quo. Actually, that's perfectly within the status quo. It's perfectly within the Taiwan Relations Act. It's perfectly within the United States' obligation to sell arms of a defensive capability to Taiwan. And I think that's something we need to increase. That's not changing the status quo. As Wei Ting pointed out, that's been part of the US-Taiwan PRC uncomfortable agreement for quite some time. Where I see sort of the pushback is sort of that disproportionate level of going beyond just sort of the typical leaning into what's already existing in the TRA, or throw the TRA out, start from square one with something that, as Wei Ting put, sort of gives the PRC more context with which to sort of escalate themselves. If Taiwan says, okay, we'll abandon the status quo, that's exactly what the PRC wants to hear in order for them to sort of take even further steps.
Great, thanks, Lev. Wei Ting, I want to let you have a chance to jump in here to respond
Yes.
to either of the comments.
Yeah. So again, I agree with actually both Lev and David. So you're both pointing out. I think they both point out, and we all agree that it's Beijing who is actively doing changes on the status quo, and so the U.S. has not been doing enough to kind of ask Beijing to retract or to decrease its aggression. And so I think that's definitely the part that Washington can do more. And I agree with Debbie that what matters right now is is not whether we should preserve the status quo. It's more like how do we operationalize what that status quo is. And I think in linking back to the point I made earlier, which is that I think it's important to stress that the status quo is changing. It's not static. It changes. It's a moving equilibrium. And I think Washington and even Taipei should try to kind of advocate for this narrative, which is that what Taiwan and Washington are both doing is actively trying to maintain status quo because the status quo is being changed by Beijing mostly. So to try to keep at that same level, to keep that equilibrium, actually requires active effort. And I think within that framework, that's why it makes sense for the U.S. to, even though it's already within the framework, to continue selling, have military sales to Taiwan, and why why Taipei should maintain as the de facto governance structure. And I think I want to kind of build upon this and try to say one more thing, which is that so in the past couple of months, I think in Washington, we see some commentary coming from Washington, basically blaming that Taiwan is the actor changing the status quo. And I think that narrative is counterproductive because, as and we all agree, Beijing is the actor that most actively revising that status quo through coercion, aggression, passing the median line, going through ADIZ zone, et cetera, and gray zone tactic. And when um, when the Washington commentary basically blames Taiwan for changing the status quo, it actually effectively adopting Beijing's narrative and shifting the blame onto the side that is trying to avoid coercion. And I think it actually does not help Washington. It deters and weakens. It goes back to what David was saying, like it weakens the deterrence and by signaling uncertainty about what the United States is actually defending. And so I think that's kind of what I think Washington can do to have a more clear idea that what we are doing right now or helping Taiwan with to engage with Taiwan is to actively trying to maintain that status quo and to have the blame distributed more according to what is actually happening on the ground. I think that's what I would add onto this discussion.
David, do you want to jump in? I see you.
Yeah, I would just say that as I think about the status quo and how we maintain it, I think that it does raise, I think that the reason why many in Washington revert back to the status quo is because it's comfortable. It's something that we've talked about for decades, and it also doesn't cause us to really force us to reassess our priors and our assumptions, and also to frankly take uncomfortable steps that might increase the risk of some kind of escalation in the Taiwan Strait, as Lev said. But what I would argue is that, we need to we need to be somewhat more willing to take certain risks and to assert our interests because I think Beijing is very happy to exploit this asymmetry that they see in terms of risk acceptant behavior. Certainly in the military realm, with how they operate around Taiwan, they know that they can push on Taiwan's territorial waters and Taiwan's military won't respond because it doesn't want to risk being seen as the aggressor. It knows that all of its ADIZ incursions will not be challenged by Taiwan or the United States. And so it is very willing to, use a term that we first use a lot in the South China Sea, to salami slice its way to trying to achieve its political objectives. And I think that the only way to respond to that is to push back against that. Now, this is not to advocate that we normalize relations with Taiwan or recognize Taiwan as a sovereign, independent country. Again, I think that the One China policy continues to serve U.S. interests well. But it is to say that we need to, as Lev said, we need to maintain a military balance in the Taiwan Strait. That's going to require doing a lot more with Taiwan's military, not just in terms of selling arms, but in terms of training and exercises, and co-development of certain weapon systems and things of that nature. That, of course, is not going to be greeted warmly in Beijing, but those are things that we need to do. We need to do a lot more with our allies in the region, Japan and Australia, even South Korea and the Philippines, to maintain a credible military deterrent vis-a-vis China. That's also going to add friction, and that's something that we need to be comfortable with. In terms of the political bucket, as China continues to press the so-called One China principle and now says that a part of the post-war order is that Taiwan is a part of the PRC, the United States is going to have to be far more public in pushing back against that and asserting its interpretation, which is rooted in the Treaty of San Francisco and other documents, that Taiwan's legal status is unresolved, and we do not agree with the interpretation that Taiwan is a part of the PRC. And we're going to have to do more with our allies and partners to try to bring other countries around to our view and to push back against this narrative that is gaining steam. So, that's all to say that I think that we need to accept a little bit more friction here. I think we need to accept that there's going to be, maybe at a kind of tactical or operational level, more tension, all in service of preserving the strategic aims that are in our interests and are in Taiwan's interests. And so that's how I kind of think about that, is we need to parse out or separate kind of the strategic effects that we're looking for and the operational and tactical policy levers that help us achieve that. And to me, at the operational and tactical level, we're going to have to change the way that we do business going forward.
Thanks to all of you. So just a reminder to our audience that you can put any questions in the Q&A box. We have a couple coming in, which I'll turn to shortly. But yeah, if you have any questions for our esteemed group of scholars to discuss here, throw them in the chat box, the Q&A box, sorry, not the chat box, and I will moderate that. So just for all three of you, there actually is, despite the desire for a spicy debate, and we do have some genuine areas of disagreement here. There is, of course, a lot of agreement, certainly that it is not a one-to-one balance in terms of how the status quo is changing. Um, but if thinking back, I think the ideal of maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait is the ultimate goal for everybody on all sides of this equation. If we think back to the example I gave with George Bush talking to Wen Jiabao in 2003 and sort of trying to publicly affirm to the PRC leadership that the US supports the status quo, which is implicitly a rebuke of then Taiwanese President Chen Shui-bian for potentially, even though he didn't actually change it, of making moves that were displeasing to Beijing. Is there any similar type of thing now that the US could do to de-escalate tensions? In that sense, it was reaffirming the status quo or reaffirming some amount of we want to assure you that we are not pushing further in a way to get you to escalate rather than doing, say, what David suggested, which is, I think, being a little bit more forceful. So if any of you want to take on that, I'd be very curious to hear a response. David, you go
Yeah,
first, and then
sure.
I'll
So
turn to
I
Lev.
thought I see Lev wants to come in on this as well, but I'll just start by saying that, I think that there's been a debate, certainly in the last 8 years or so, but more pronounced, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years about who started this spiral, so to speak, and is the United States also doing things with Taiwan that is forcing Beijing's hand and forcing it to do the things that I said in my opening remarks. Um, and I think that you could point to certain things that the United States did and say, okay, well, we did X, so of course Beijing was going to do Y. Um, but I think we're in an interesting moment here because I think any objective observer would say that U.S.-Taiwan cooperation right now is lower than it has been for years. If we look at, high-level interactions, if we look at arms sales, if we look at rhetorical support for Taiwan, I would say all of that has been weaker under the second Trump administration than it was under the Biden administration. Now, ask yourself, has Beijing taken its foot off the gas as U.S. support for Taiwan has arguably weakened? No, it continues to push ahead as much as it can. And so on a daily basis, the military coercion of Taiwan continues apace. If we look at what the PRC is doing vis-a-vis Japan right now, right, that is an enormous amount of coercion being put against a U.S. treaty ally because of what the Japanese prime minister said over Taiwan. But I would argue that that's well within her rights to say what she did and is not necessarily a major a statement that should prompt that kind of escalation. But if we just look at the U.S.-Taiwan dynamics right now, you have a fundamental change in one of the variables, but we don't see any change in Beijing's behavior. At least I haven't been able to pick it up yet. So to me, I think that really puts the ball back in the court of people who are saying, well, if the United States just toned down the rhetoric on Taiwan, lowered arms sales, lowered support, then Beijing would take that as a signal, and it would also reduce tension around the Taiwan question. And I just don't see evidence for that view right now.
Lev, I know you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, echoing a point a little bit, America's silence on Taiwan has been rather deafening. And I don't even just mean President Trump. I really mean sort of the long-term political bipartisan support for Taiwan from both parties has been very quiet. Now, to a degree, this is understandable. America is currently going through its own political moment, as is the rest of the world, as we collectively sort of face new levels of uncertainty and unpredictability from the United States, which has caused Taiwan, along with a host of other foreign policy issues that I know are beyond the scope of this discussion, to sort of just become secondary on the back burner. And Taiwan has truly suffered because of that. This is not just the United States that has become more quiet on Taiwan. Arguably, most European countries have become more quiet on Taiwan, with the exception of a small number of smaller European powers that still maintain close ties with Taiwan. But this is really something that has felt particularly noticeable, especially here in Taipei. And this is really sort of a broader change in the world under Trump 2.0 about how foreign policy is conducted. And I think we just feel the most of that here in Taiwan, as the PRC, as David very nicely put, has not taken its foot off the gas, while America has emphatically taken its foot off the gas. And that's very concerning. The one other thing I just wanted to finger on with Wei Ting's comments, because I'm sure someone is going to ask this about what about William Lai and what about what Taiwan does to disrupt the status quo. This is something I said in my opening remark, but I think there's often a desire to make William Lai and Xi Jinping a one-to-one comparison. And while, again, like I said, William Lai certainly says things that I think are more disruptive than helpful for maintaining the status quo, I just don't think it is nearly as powerful or truly disruptive as what the PRC has done to change the status quo.
Great, thanks, Lev. Wei Ting, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, just very quickly building on what Lev just said, and you mentioned twice already, like how Bush in the early 2000s and how the United States publicly made statement about maintaining the status quo. And so I think even for the DPP government, they have learned that lesson. They know what is the kind of a reasonable room for maneuver. So I think since 2016, since the first kind of Tsai administration, I think one thing she have done successfully or not successfully is that she basically has successfully kind of equate Republic of China, Taiwan, East Taiwan thing. And so I think that kind of contribute to the rising amount of people endorsing maintaining the status quo. Because for them, maintaining the status quo means remaining whatever system we have, which is a governing democratic system that is called the Republic of China. And so I don't think William Lai will deviate too much from that, at least for his first term. I don't see it's a rational behavior to deviate too much away from this point. And the second kind of point I want to add on to what David was saying. So indeed, I think the second Trump term is concerning, and Lev already pointed out from Taiwan's perspective, it is a lot of uncertainty and not assurance from Washington. And I think it's very clear also that Beijing is actively testing what the Trump administration can accept. And so for me, I agree with David that I think that Washington needs to take a more assertive stance on this. And again, for me personally, that remains with the goal to maintain the status quo, because the other part is just testing and testing on all fronts. And David pointed out their newest kind of effort right now is on the historical narrative. And so it's not just military, it's legally, and then it's a historical narrative. And the US, if not taking Taiwan is trying to do its, voice its perspective, but I think US still plays an important role now, signaling to other allies in the world what positions they should be taking. Yeah. Okay. So that's my point.
That's great. And that there were a number of questions from our audience about the Trump administration's changing policies. So I think we've touched on that a little bit, and the uncertainty that's come from the current foreign policy approach in Trump's second term. I want to turn to a question from the audience, which reflects something that I've been thinking here and something that Wei Ting just touched upon, which is the international symbolic element of this, right? There are three countries or three actors involved here, right? We have Washington, Beijing, and Taipei and their respective territories. Um, but of course, there's a lot more. There's many more people involved, and as David said, the Prime Minister of Japan's recent comments about Taiwan, that a contingency in Taiwan could be an existential issue for Japan, has launched a major pressure campaign uh, from the PRC. So Alec in the chat asks, given that so many countries accept the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China, and the U.S. of course does legally as well, how can the U.S. frame its involvement with Taiwan internationally, perhaps in the event of military action? And I think also to add on to that, thinking about to what extent, if we're changing the status quo or we are doing something different, what is the symbolic message that we're trying to send to other international actors in the region, whether Japan or somebody else? I'll let any of you step up who desires. David.
Well, I think that the fundamental point is that we don't take the view that that Taiwan is a part of the People's Republic of China. So we'd push back on that narrative. And again, Beijing, as Wei Ting said and I said earlier, they continue to trot out now the Potsdam Declaration and the Cairo Declaration, which have no standing in terms of international law. Which were basically communiques that were reached in the midst of World War II, but actually the Treaty of San Francisco, which does have far more weight in international law, does not have that same view of Taiwan that the PRC continues to put forward. So I would just say that from the U.S. perspective, the view of Taiwan's legal status is that it is unresolved. And the United States does not take a view on, what a resolution should look like. It's not trying to negotiate between the two parties, but it's about the way in which a resolution is reached, which is that it has to be non-coercive and have the assent of the people on Taiwan. And so, according to current U.S. policy, if a supermajority of Taiwanese were to wake up tomorrow and say, we want to become a part of the PRC, and they voted for that in a non-coercive way, then the United States would support that according to current U.S. policy. But if the PRC were to use, coercion or kinetic force against Taiwan to compel unification, then the United States would oppose that. So I think that the answer to the question is that we just have a fundamentally different view than the PRC of Taiwan's legal status. And to be honest, other countries do share our view. The PRC has been able to leverage its influence in the global south to get countries to adopt the so-called One China principle and its view. But I think the United States and its allies do not share that view. What I would say in terms of how you make the case to U.S. allies, this is something that is different in terms of the audience you're speaking to. But I think one thing that has really changed in the last 5 years or so is just that just how much economic devastation we're talking about in a conflict over Taiwan and an awareness, especially in Europe, about the implications of that for their economies. So, Bloomberg had a report a few years ago that that estimated the costs of a conflict over Taiwan at $10 trillion, which is roughly 10% of global GDP. I think that, that prompted a lot of governments in Europe to wonder, where are they going to be getting their chips from? Where are they going to be getting the inputs that they need to make cars, to make electronics, and that they were not going to be spared from a conflict over Taiwan. And I think you can trace a lot more of the kind of rhetoric coming out of Europe, lodging their concern with the Chinese and also in public documents as well, with just an understanding of the economic implications of that. I think in East Asia, they're obviously far more closer geographically. And for Japan, it is more a question about what it means for Japan's security if the PLA is less than 100 miles from Japanese territory. It is about, I think, for Japan, the integrity of the first island chain. And then I think for other countries in the region, it is about, is this the first step in a Chinese bid for regional hegemony? And what does their security look like if you do have a regional hegemon in Beijing with, a United States with far less influence? So I think that there are different arguments for different audiences. Some it's more about the economic implications, and others it's about hard security and geopolitical ramifications.
So I'm in the interest of time because we're running up against our limits here, and we have a bunch of great questions in chat. I'm going to move on to the next one, which actually touches on something that David said, which is about the economic implications. So David in the chat asks, isn't the economic relationship and commercial dependence one of the real foundations of the status quo? Either Wei Ting or Lev, do you want to comment on the role of economics in maintaining the status quo and perhaps what has changed in uh, recent years on the economic side?
Uh, I can add a few points here, but I kind of want to build upon what David said
Please.
earlier. Um, so I agree completely that for different partners, like different countries, the rhetoric should be different. For some, it's more economic aspect, which we'll talk about later, and for others, it's closer Indo-Pacific allies. It should be more about security and stability and open Indo-Pacific. And but I think one more sim kind of more macro level statement I want to make is that I think it's a myth to think that it's a zero-sum game between a productive China policy versus a productive Taiwan policy. It's like you can either have one of those. And I think Lev shared that because we had this discussion before that I don't think it's the case. Like it can be productive for both, have a very successful productive China policy and also have some Taiwan policy, whatever you want to call that policy. And and to create those economic ties or security dialogue for countries in Asia Pacific. Um, but back to the economic foundation of the status quo. I think there is an aspect of that. I mostly still view that as a kind of like an outcome of one China principle, one China policy, and Taiwan being a de facto ROC government. Um, I don't really see an economic side of this changing. So with Beijing's changing position, it's not necessarily because, of course, it used to have a more priority on economic development, but its military aggression and all that is not because its economy has grown to a level that is so good right now that it can expand to other aspects. I think its military aggression stands it's in and of itself as a main trigger for the changing of the status quo. I think that's what my response.
Lev, I see you nodding. Is there anything you want to quickly add there before we go to another question?
Just to very quickly, I love David. You used the phrase earlier, strategic friction, and I think when it comes to symbolic actions, I think that really sort of needs to be at the front, which is that if we're going to do strategic actions in terms of symbolism, we got to make sure that there's real material benefit. And as Wei Ting said, I'm a firm believer that good China policy and good Taiwan policy are not zero sum. And in fact, we see this specifically with symbolic actions, like whether or not a country adheres to a one China principle or a one China policy. Like, for example, I know there was just the news that one of the foreign ministers in Taiwan just took a secret trip to Israel. Israel acknowledges the one China principle. It says that Taiwan is part of China. But that doesn't stop Taiwan from being able to actually have relations with countries that don't necessarily abide by what Taiwan would like them to say. A lot of these symbolic policies are actually not nearly as critical. And this is, something that I think is important that we don't have time to get into, but that's sort of why a lot of symbolic victories, symbolic policies, I just don't think necessarily are as meaningful as others might.
Very quickly here, also from the chat, we have Jiaqian who asks, we asked, what does the PRC or Xi Jinping mean by the status quo? Is there anything about the status quo that the Beijing side wants to keep, or are they just interested in pushing? So just very briefly, is there anything, does the PRC want the status quo in any capacity? I think that's an important thing to briefly touch on.
So I would say there is one thing about the status quo, which is that the status quo is that the current government of Taiwan is the Republic of China. Uh, and when I say it's the not ideal status quo, it's because a lot of people in Taiwan don't necessarily identify with that, but are willing to accept that. And I think that's part of the general status quo that has some value from at least the PRC's perspective. If that part of the status quo changed, I think we would see a very different kind of reaction from the PRC.
Great. And we only have about 1 minute left, so we can meet our hard stop at 9, as assuming my clock is correct. And there's a few more questions in the chat, and I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody. But I want to end with one here, which is a little bit forward-looking, and is interesting, which is Tony asks, Trump and Xi Jinping are going to meet in April, or at least they're planning to, barring any crazy happenings between now and April. What should the U.S. do or say to make all the parties support the status quo? Is there anything? Obviously, it's on the table through various reporting that Trump is perhaps willing to trade Taiwan for some sort of economic deal. Looking into the talks in April and moving forward this year, what should the United States do to protect the status quo, or protect at least the objective, the operationalized versions of what we'd want looking to that meeting and ahead? I'll let each of you answer as also a concluding set of statements if there's anything you want to add as we wrap up here. Wei-Ting, I see your
Yeah.
audio is on.
So from Taiwan's perspective, realistically, I think the best that could happen for when Xi meets Trump in April is to keep Taiwan out of the conversation. Like not talking about Taiwan, I think will be good enough right now for Taiwan. Just not putting this topic on the table. Yeah, because once this is on the table, we don't know where the direction of that conversation will go. Yep.
Lev.
In my ideal fantasy world in which we have nothing but rational actors at the table, I would love for de-escalation and sort of military happenings in the cross strait to be part of discussion. And it would be great if the U.S. Government could either then or later say exactly what it means by the status quo and what it's doing to uphold it. But given the actors that we have, I would agree with Wei-Ting and hope that Taiwan just doesn't come up.
Yeah. So to Lev's point, I mean, I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs with my friend Marvin Park a few months ago that was arguing that this could be an opportunity to pursue some kind of mutual military de-escalation with Beijing, and to use that as a way of just more generally assessing Beijing's intentions and the extent to which one can actually influence Chinese behavior in the Taiwan Strait, and induce some kind of restraint in terms of Beijing's actions. So I think that that would be my best case scenario. The worst case scenario, I think, would be a public statement by President Trump that he opposes Taiwan independence, which I fear is something that he could view as a cost-free thing to give to Xi Jinping in exchange for something in the economic realm or elsewhere. But I think that most or all cross-strait observers would view that as a big concession, and it would be a severe blow, I think, for President Lai in Taiwan, and cause significant political upheaval in Taiwan, and really also accelerate what we refer to as the America skepticism theory, the notion that the United States is not a reliable partner for Taiwan, that could be looking for opportunities to sell out its interests in exchange for things from China. So I think that's the worst case scenario. I agree with Wei Ting. I think that and maybe Lev in this sense, that the best case scenario would be that there's nothing on Taiwan. But I also think that there's a small chance that we could see some kind of tactical adjustments in terms of the military operations around Taiwan, which would also be a very good thing. But I'm not necessarily optimistic that that's the path that we're going to go down.
Great. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. I would keep talking about this for hours, but we do have to end to allow our Taiwanese compatriots here to get ready for bed, and the rest of us in the East Coast to get ready for work. And but thank you so much to Lev, Wei Ting, David, and FPRI for this. I think that you should all also read all of their research and writing. So look up each of our panelists. I certainly reference their research frequently when I'm thinking about Taiwan. And we're really grateful for all of them for joining us today and all of you for excellent questions and being such an engaged audience. Thank you guys so much. See you at other events.